Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day one of week 7 in History and Systems of Psychology. I have a bit of a voice problem, as you may hear. It's like I swallowed one of Helmholtz's frogs. That's a History and Systems inside joke. Thank you for those who are smiling. Anyway, please bear with me as we move through this. I hope everyone's doing well. It's a beautiful day to be here, right, in a classroom, but I hope you enjoy some time outside if you get an opportunity. I wanted to start by recapping what we went over on Thursday. So what do you remember from that lecture? We're looking at Gestalt psychology. So tell me some things that you remember about Gestalt psychology.
It focuses on the way on how your brain perceives objects and try to group them as a whole new object or just with organization kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's like looking at the form of things rather than looking at an object and looking at its different pieces first and then how those pieces relate to the whole. You're looking at the whole object. And then how those pieces, how you perceive those pieces is what makes that object, right? And I thought that was demonstrated very well with the visual representations that we saw in class, okay? So remember, the closest that German comes to form is Gestalt. And so just remember this has to do with the form, again, versus the function, okay? What else? Watch the video. What else can you tell me?
The different principles that there were. The proximity principle, the principle of similarity, the principle of closure, the principle of good continuation, and the principle of common fate.
Excellent. Those are 5 different principles, right? Good job on the note taking. And then we looked at those principles at work in advertising, right? And what were some ones we looked at? I know we looked at New Balance.
Executive Homes is one of them.
Oh, Executive Homes, yes, the E and the H. What else?
Pepsi logo.
Pepsi logo.
The Chanel logo.
The Chanel, yeah, I shouldn't have forgotten that. So other things. Arby's, yeah, with the hat. That was a good one, I think. And then I believe I showed the Subway logo, maybe not. But next time you look at the Subway logo, know that the arrows, the green and the yellow, the white space makes a what? Not a sandwich, but an S. Okay, it does, I promise you. Okay. All right, we are going to go ahead and go on to today's lesson. Okay, so we can go ahead and check off review Thursday's material. I'm going to be assigning a reflection, and this is going to be due not this Sunday, but the next Sunday. It's going to be a photo voice project. And what I'm wanting you to do is pick out 5 of the philosophers, people that we have studied so far, early psychologists. You're going to take a picture of something that abstractly represents their ideas, okay? And then next to that, you're going to tell me a little bit about what that person's known for. So we're definitely using the great man approach here, right? What that person is known for and why you took the kind of picture you did. Okay, so we might think about, I was looking at your herbology shirt, I could maybe take a picture of that and say that represents Hippocrates, right? And why might I say that? I don't think it's the cold medicine.
So once we made the list of, for this condition, basically showed relationships between cures and
And that a lot of cures could be found in plants and in things of that nature, pun intended. So I will have guidelines, but again, the idea is you select 5 people you want to talk about. Then you take a picture that represents their ideas. You talk briefly about 4 sentences about that person's legacies in your own words, and then a couple of sentences telling me why you chose this photo. Like, this represents Helmholtz. I mean, taking a picture of a frog leg would be really easy. Maybe you can be more creative than that, but it'll work. Sort of makes sense? Okay. These are, I think, in a way, a little bit more fun to do sometimes than a paper. I don't know who enjoys doing papers? Occasionally? Never? Rarely? All right. We'll put it on a Likert scale. One more thing I wanted to mention. This week is Eating Disorders Awareness Week. I'm not going to take time to open it up, but there is a link that will take you to lots of events that are being held online during this week. Also, if you check out myrsu.edu, in the news and highlights, there's a list of all of the events that are going to be taking place throughout the remainder of the week at RSU. To that end, any of those events that you go to and you take a little selfie of yourself at the event, all right, you're going to get 5 points extra credit. So you can gather up those selfies and send them to me. And yeah, someone made we had a clay crafting event and made like a really great giraffe. It was really fun. I tried to make something with Dr. Moon. We were somewhat successful, but it was a lot of fun. So there are a lot of events you can still attend. All right. So we are going into the land of experimental psychology today. Want to ask you, when you think of an experiment, what comes to mind? And I'm going to grab the board over here. Why don't you take a moment and jot a few things down? Okay, take one more minute. Okay, so what are some things that come to mind? Carl Jung did a lot with word association tests, so what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of an experiment? So what's the first thing that came to mind?
I'll tell you, for me, it was this. Even though I know it goes beyond the realm of test tubes, I didn't do very well in biology in high school, and I managed to, I think, get an A or a B by cleaning test tubes. That was my extra credit. Yeah, I'd be in there for an hour. And it's kind of laughable in that I'm not really a dishwashing kind of person to begin with. So that's the one time I had dishpan hands was from that. But anyway, so that's the first thing I think about, but others might have other items that come to mind. So how about that?
Is that ingredients?
Ingredients, I like that one. Okay. We're gonna come back to that one. Okay, other things.
To go along with that, I thought about like the groups, like your control group, your experimental group.
So that's one of the ingredients, right? You have your treatment groups. Or treatment group, and we're gonna say this is control group. All right, keep going.
Trial and error.
Very good, trial and error. What else? Nothing else?
Another one if it was redundant, because it can be really redundant.
Yes, it can be. And that's actually, we kind of want results to be redundant when we run an experiment. If it's worth its weight, so to speak, we want to see those findings replicated. It's very, I would say, to go with redundant, maybe a kinder, gentler way is like methodological. It's very step-by-step, precise order. Anything else that comes to mind? Everyone with me? Okay, so oftentimes when people think of experiments, they think about experiments in a formal lab setting, right? Where you did have the test tubes, or maybe you were looking under a microscope.
But experiments come in all shapes and sizes, and we'll get back to you, or get back to that in a moment. That's my cold medicine kicking in. So one more thing I want to say, Eric touched on this, the control group and the treatment group. So when we design an experiment, we are dealing with a dependent and independent variable, all right? I love to use this as an example. I love yoga, so we're going to use that. So let's say that we want to improve people's subjective well-being by participating in yoga over some amount of time, okay? Subjective well-being is something that we can measure in a lot of different ways, but let's say that we're going to measure it using Diner's subjective well-being scale. So you are measuring your dependent variable because you want to know before people start the yoga, where are they well-being wise, okay? Are they already feeling really great? Because if that's the case and they do yoga, if they get just a little bit greater, we're going to see that as a minuscule difference, right? So we want to see everyone's baseline. And then we have our control group. How long do you think it would take to reap the benefits of participating in yoga? How many of you have done yoga? Okay, any ideas for those that have done it?
I think it depends on how intentional you are.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say.
Like, and what
Yeah.
you're trying to get out of it. Like, because I know there's some yoga where it's like more like stretching and like breathing and stuff. And I feel like that you could get pretty quick, like get something out of it like pretty quick if you're like really intentional with it.
Uh-huh.
But like if it's more of like a workout yoga type of thing,
Yeah.
I think it would take a little bit longer to see like growth within it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too. Even when working out, like being intentional, think of the muscle groups that are moving and things like that and being very present. It's hard to measure intentionality. You hope people are being intentional, but you don't know. So it might be how people perceive yoga and what they're hoping to, quote unquote, get out of it, right? They want to do yoga for maybe building muscle or becoming more flexible. And that's great, right? But that's different than doing yoga to come to more peace of mind and things within that realm. So the intention makes a difference. And so what we might say is, if we don't somehow factor that in, like what made you interested in being in this study, and ask a question that kind of answers that, that could be a confounding variable, right? And confounding variable, everyone, is something that gets in the way of our research results.
Okay. Let's just say, because you said it could really vary based on how long, what people's intentions are. Let's say we're going to do 8 weeks, 2 times a week. So everyone, for the exam, you'll need to understand how an experiment is set up. And this is information that's not really talked a lot about in our chapter, but you'll need to know these basic building blocks. So this is your independent variable, all right? And there are 3 levels of the independent variable. We have our 8 weeks, 2 times a week, people who are doing yoga, and they're getting an instructor, and this means face-to-face, all right? So we're going to see which of these is most effective. Then we have another yoga group. It's also going to be during the same time period, but it's going to be online. Now, is it important that it be the same instructor if at all possible? Yes, why?
Different personalities, different training modalities.
Exactly. We want the class to look like, to the greatest extent, the same class,
Whether it's face-to-face or whether it is online.
Maybe even like this class, you could have, you know, one that's videoed, and then do the people who are taking it via online, which is the one who are in network that eliminates any.
Yeah, exactly. So a great way to keep it, to know that it's the same, is you would have people taking the class, and then you would have the same session, but you'd be having the instructor being videoed, and people would take the class virtually. So you'd have your in-person, and it would be the same instructor. Yeah, good idea. And then we have the control group. Are we going to ask them, don't do yoga?
Should you ever tell someone not to do yoga? Never, no. All right. They're going to continue to do whatever they do in real life. All right. You understand, if you tell people not to do yoga, then you have another treatment group. All right. So this goes on for 8 weeks, and then we follow up and we retest our dependent variable. So we retest with Diner's subjective well-being scale. And what we want to see number-wise is there a significant difference in subjective well-being based on whether someone did the in-person or virtual, okay? If there is a significant difference in statistics, that means it's not due to chance, all right? So 2 more things that'll be on the exam that I want to talk about. Okay. Everyone, an extraneous variable is anything outside of these 2 variables, okay? So it could be how tall someone is, their political party preference, what they majored in college, anything having to do with the individual that's not being examined within the research study, okay? Some of these extraneous variables, however, can be confounding. So intentionality could potentially be confounding. What else?
They were seeking like overall to have a better
well-being, like they might have started medication at the same time.
So you have people coming in, and I'm not sure how to put that on there, but you have people coming in who are interested in the study because they want to improve their well-being, okay? And so they're already perhaps more invested than your common person, as it were. Your hoi polloi, which was an exam question that a lot of people missed, but we'll talk about that later. And so they might also be doing other things, right? Or sometimes when you get into something like yoga or working out, you start to develop some better habits, right? Like you maybe go to bed earlier and you sleep more deeply.
And that improves your sense of well-being. Okay, good. Other things that could confound the results.
Additional workouts.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So like if it was like a situation of like workout yoga and you're like testing like strength and like how much weight you can push or something.
Yeah.
If you were doing additional workouts on top of that, not included in the study, your results could vary.
Yeah, and so you could either sort of, kind of an odd way to say it, but like disqualify someone if they did that, or you could ask them that question, you know, what are you doing outside of this activity-wise, level of activity, type of physical activity? Does that make sense? So then you're taking the extraneous variable and you're controlling for it because you see it as potentially confounding. How about age? I feel like that could be a big one, right? Anything else you can think of? Huh? Their size, yeah, that can make a difference. And it even can make a difference to someone who feels like they want to do it or not, right? Who feels comfortable doing it. Good, good. What else?
I feel like you could almost add almost infinite variables to that, because anything can affect it. Like, in one sense, anything that's, it may not be directly related, but everything connects to everything else.
Yeah.
In 17 different ways.
I like that point. And so that's always a limitation of research, right? I don't say always a lot, but there are going to be limitations of research and that we're not going to be able to control for all the variables that could potentially be confounding. What we need to do is we need to be aware of what research is out there right now on this. What have they seen? Like you're reading through the research, you're finding out
What they've done in the past, what they've been successful doing, what they've seen as, okay, if I were to do this again, I would control for size or something like that. So you want to try to pick the variables that you think are most sensitive to being potential confounders. All right? Okay. Sort of, kind of makes sense? All right. Okay, we're going to watch a short video. Now, I've heard Wilhelm Wundt as the proper pronunciation, but depending on which video you watch or who you talk with, it's kind of like Carl Jung, Carl Jung. Some people say Jung, which generally no, that's not going to be it. But I just wanted to say that because this person says it another way, but I think it is an interesting, very short encapsulation of Wundt's lasting legacy. Go ahead and take notes on this. I'll break you up into groups and we'll talk, we'll reform as a class after that. Okay. Can I see? Perhaps not. All right.
Doesn't matter what.
Clever. Gestalt psychology. No, just joking.
Nearly 250 years ago,
delegates from the 13 American colonies gathered in Philadelphia to sign a revolutionary
Nope.
document declaring that they were no longer
Oh my goodness, you
subjects,
guys, what
but
is going on? Okay.
Hello, all you big, beautiful brains.
I like SNL,
Today,
but-
we're going to talk about Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wilhelm Wundt has a really special name. He's called the father of psychology. And it sounds like this really big title, but he got that name because he did something that was so simple and yet completely revolutionary. So, let me set the stage for you. Prior to the mid-1800s, no one had ever studied what we now call psychology in a scientific way. There were philosophers who tried to understand the way we think the way that we do, or medical doctors who tried to cure neurological problems, but no one had actually specifically studied the processes of the human brain or why it makes us behave the way that we do. This all changed when Wilhelm Wundt came along. Wundt studied to become a medical doctor and earned his degree in the medical field in 1856. And you're going to be saying, well, why medicine? Why didn't he just get a psychology degree? Well, it's because psychology wasn't a thing yet. It didn't exist. Medicine was about the closest that he could get. After getting his degree, Wundt began publishing lectures that he gave, and he even published a textbook about the human body, which was really focused on the brain and your senses. So, what did Wundt do that made him this hugely influential figure in psychology? Well, in 1879, Wundt created the first ever laboratory to study psychology scientifically. Here's why that's important. Science is all about testing predictions. For psychologists, the predictions that we make are usually about behaviors or attitudes. Having a specific setting, such as a laboratory, gives psychologists the opportunity to eliminate outside conditions that could impact the behavior or attitude that they're trying to measure. For instance, right now you're sitting on your phone watching this video, and really you could be anywhere. If I wanted to measure things like how much you like this video, like and subscribe. And you could be impacted by all those things. So say your little sister keeps coming in while you're watching the video and pestering you. Or you're getting rude texts from your boss, right? You're going to rate your enjoyment of this video a lot lower than if you're in an environment where something that you like is going on. Say your favorite song is playing in the background. In a laboratory setting, you can eliminate both good things, like hearing your favorite song, and bad things, like getting yelled at. In a lab, you can be in a neutral setting, where we could get a more accurate reflection about how you truly feel about what you're watching, which you love. Like and subscribe. Ring the bell. All those fun YouTube things. Wundt started conducting early psychological research by doing experiments using the scientific method. Approaching the study of psychology this way was groundbreaking, and scholars started coming from all over the world. And he set up this whole institute that became the Institute for Experimental Psychology. Most of the major names that you'll hear from the days of early psychology came directly from Wundt's lab and worked with him, collaborated with him on projects. So people like Charles Spearman, who was this really influential statistician, or Walter Dill Scott, who was one of the very first organizational psychologists, and big name James Cattell, the first ever psychology professor here in the US. And it's certainly due to Wilhelm Wundt and his simple yet revolutionary idea of the psychology laboratory that psychology became the influential field that it is today. So, if you'd like to know about Wundt, make sure you watch our video about the theory he created, structuralism. I'll link it in the description down below. And until next time, see y'all later. Bye.
All right, I love this, gratitude interventions, the psychology of Thanksgiving. All right, I don't think we'll break into groups. That was a really short video, but I do want to talk about some things you might have learned or found interesting. Hopefully there's at least something that you found interesting, right? Nothing?
Why it took so long before somebody said, hey, let's try to study this in a non-biased manner? Like we're just.
Yes. It took way too long, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's think about studying this in an unbiased manner. Let's control for variables. It's amazing, and it changed the landscape, right? And it became the underpinnings of psychology today. So, anything else? Thank you for that.
We created the psychology laboratory where famous psychologists
Yeah.
studies that.
So famous psychologists, you'll note that, or you should note that a lot of experimental psychology and stats, they're tied closely. So Spearman was a great statistician, as was Cattell. Spearman actually has a statistical procedure. If you go do stats on a computer, it's called Spearman's Row, and it's a way of analyzing data. So yeah, good, thank you for that. Anything else? All right, so excuse me. What sort of picture do you get in your head if you've only watched that? Maybe you've read ahead, but if not, of Wilhelm Wundt. Picture of a man, portrait of a man. Should I ask you to draw? No, your graphical representation? Perhaps not. Well, to answer that question, we'll go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So let me try this again. Okay. All right, so if you'd like to follow along in the textbook, we're on page 175, and then we kind of go backwards and we go forwards again. So Wundt was born in Mannheim, Germany. He was born in a really small town, and his father was an evangelical pastor. So like a lot of other
Psychologists that we'll be studying moving forward, many of them actually came from families where there was a strong religious background, which actually was also just pretty common back in the day. His family had solid academic connections. His grandpa had been a professor of history, and uncles had been physicians and professors of physiology. So he came to his interest through interacting with his uncles and with his grandfather. he was an ill child and contracted malaria. Can you imagine how awful that would be? Like, and I wanted to, and he was sort of a little bit of the depressive personality. If we turn to page 176, it says, bottom of 175, as an infant, he contracted malaria. His worried parents had lost 2 children in infancy. They moved him to more climatically healthier parishes in farming villages. So Wilhelm grew up essentially as an only child in these rural communities. His early memory was of falling down a staircase, his head striking painfully on every step. A similar depressive tone pervaded most of his other childhood reminiscences. So he was really ready to get a move on and found psychology, right? Bleak and isolated childhood and adolescence. These are the descriptors that our author gives of Wundt. Clumsy and unathletic, his father being a pastor. He was an easy target of bullying. He would get in trouble at school and at home due to constant daydreaming. Eventually, though, he persevered. He graduated from medical school, and I think that he graduated in medical school in 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so he's going to become a doctor. His development as a researcher, his first independent research was performed at Heidelberg under the supervision of Robert Bunsen. So Bunsen burner, I don't know if you guys know what that is, but yeah, that's the connection there. And when I think of experiments, I think of Bunsen burners. So pretty great tutelage, you know, to be studying under someone of that intellectual capacity. But early on, he really wanted to do his own thing. And to illustrate, one of his first scientific publication was based on a research study. And on page 177, it talks about it. Wundt studied the influence of salt deprivation on the composition of his own urine, and in 1853 reported the results in his first scientific publication. All right? So he was doing these, he did this in a really methodological way. So you can see where that experimental element is starting to come across. And then he looked at something called the vagus nerve, which I want to show you. So he looked at the effect of the vagus nerve on respiration. And when you have time, everyone, I'd like for you to read over this. The vagus nerve is also known as the wandering nerve. It's the largest nerve in our body. And it has a lot of different functions, sensory, special sensory, motor, and parasympathetic. Okay. He practiced medicine for a brief time, but enjoyed research much more. Who does that remind you of? Who have we covered that went into the Army to pay off medical school and then developed a lab at the Army barracks? Helmholtz, yes, for $500. Not really. Just that would be coercion. I can't do that as a professor. But Helmholtz, yes, all right. And he was looking at frogs. And just to capitalize on this moment, what was he looking for in terms of like frog functioning, as it were? Everyone with me? Yeah, so the speed of nerve signals throughout the body. All right. Okay, so he really enjoyed research. Evidently that salt deprivation of his own urine study was pretty interesting, and really, I mean, I'm being facetious, but it was pretty groundbreaking to do something like that. Helmholtz, this idea of being isolated and things, it sounds like it was pervasive throughout his life. He was Helmholtz's assistant for 6 years, but he definitely didn't want to stay an assistant, all right? He recognized that Helmholtz had a lot to offer, but at the same time, he was pretty staunch in his belief that I have a lot to offer too, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to go off on my own direction and do something. So that was always really prevalent, and as a result, he was known for maybe not being the most friendly person to work with. It said in the book that he buried himself in research and never formed a strong relationship with Helmholtz or other research assistants. During this time, he studied and wrote about vision and perception of space. So in addition to what he did on the vagus nerve, on urine composition, he also looked at this. And with that perception of vision and space, you can see elements of the physiological coming into play here. All right. So if you want to look in the book, on page 174, we have Helmholtz's thought meter. Looks dated, absolutely, right? Like a grandfather clock sort of thing. And the contraption they talk about on page 173. It says, in 1861, Wundt wanted to test the common assumption that when two different stimuli strike our senses at the same time, such as hearing someone speak and seeing their lips moving, we become consciously aware of both stimuli at the same instant. All right, so just think about that. Someone's lips moving and hearing them speak at the same time. I mean, for us, we think about that as something that's happening instantaneously, but is it really? That's what Wundt wanted to look at. So he devised this simple but clever home experiment by rigging his own pendulum clock into a thought meter. Figure 5.1, the figure we just looked at, shows the clock's pendulum. He attached a needle to the shaft of the pendulum so it would strike a bell at precisely the instant the pendulum reached the extremity of its swing. All right. He tested his own reactions to discover something unusual. As he looked at the swinging pendulum and judged the spot it seemed to occupy the moment he heard the bell, he found it was never exactly at position B, but somewhere away from that spot. Does that make sense? So he thought he was perceiving it like in real time, but there was some amount of discrepancy there. And that's what spurred some of this research. By his calculation, the time necessary for the pendulum to swing this extra distance was between 1/8 and 1/10 of a second. He concluded that he had not consciously experienced the audio and visual stimuli simultaneously, even though they had actually occurred together. Instead, separate acts of intention had apparently been required. I found that really fascinating. Well, I find it fascinating whenever I read this. These experiments were what led to the establishment of experimental psychology. Okay. Like others, we have a growing list of people who felt that psychology needed to stay under that philosophy umbrella, right? He was like that. Philosophy was highly regarded around the world, but specifically within the German context as a sort of superior discipline. And he thought, well, this is a good place for it. Important psychological processes he believed could not be researched through the experimental method. So a little bit more on the thought meter. We talked about the mental chronometry piece that he developed. What he did, everyone, and every time I zoom out, I lose the big screen here. No, don't do that. So he proposed a second and complementary branch, as if he wasn't already busy, right, doing this thing. It's pretty amazing. And he called it Volcker psychology. He said, well, you know, we can do these things, these experiments under the sort of parameter or heading of philosophy, but that this psychology would use comparative and historical methods instead of experiments. So that's what he believed psychology would do. Now, roughly translated, Volk is people, nation, tribe, or race, but was not quite the right description. A lot of times you've heard the term, things get lost in translation. That's definitely true. What Wundt meant to signal a type of non-experimental psychology that explores the communication and cultural products of human nature. So I think it's interesting that someone who was known for exacting procedures and delving into his research so much could pull out and see, you know, this is only part of the picture, right? We need this other stuff too. So, more work. After formulating the two branches of psychology, Wundt began actively pursuing both. Now, one would think with all of this recognition and everything he did that he would be pretty well off financially, but that was not the case, everyone. He was teaching classes as an assistant professor and he wasn't getting paid anything, okay? He would only get paid for special lecture courses and the students would pay him privately for that. His fortune changed, however, in 1867. In his spare time, he wrote The Principles of Physiological Psychology, which was the new, he defined it as the new domain of science, and it was the first genuine psychology book. And if we have time on Thursday, we'll look at a few pages of that. He observed that physiology investigates living organisms by our externals. So again, this sensory perception type of thing, which had been going on for a while. External senses, while psychology examines things from within and tries to explain processes that emerge from this internal perception. He became highly in demand, all right? He won a full professorship in philosophy at the University of Zurich, despite the fact he only took one philosophy course during his education. And he later accepted an equivalent position at Leipzig. And on this next slide, if you want to look at the university, you can do that. It's very pretty. Okay. What we're going to do now, part of this is just to save my voice a little bit. We're going to watch a video. It's experimental psychology, but it's not in the realm of test tubes and Bunsen burners, all right? This is going to look at, well, it's called Does Money Make You Mean? So, and now that I've given you the title, that might be a confounding factor in how you interpret all this, but I hope not. Some of you, if you've had other classes with me, I've used it, I think, in research methods before. So this is an example of experimental design within the realm of social psychology. I would like for you to take notes. We will talk about this after class, all right? Okay. I'm going to do this one last time.
I took two things that I love, dancing and dogs, and I made them into a successful business. Hi, I'm Ronnie. I'm the owner of Ketatov, and I teach people all...
I want you to, for a moment, think about playing a game of Monopoly. Except in this game, that combination of skill, talent, and luck that help earn you success in games as in life has been rendered irrelevant because this game's been rigged and you've got the upper hand. You've got more money, more opportunities to move around the board, and more access to resources. And as you think about that experience, I want you to ask yourself, how might that experience of being a privileged player in a rigged game change the way that you think about yourself and regard that other player? So we ran a study on the UC Berkeley campus to look at exactly that question. We brought in more than 100 pairs of strangers into the lab, and with the flip of a coin, randomly assigned one of the two to be a rich player in a rigged game. They got 2 times as much money. When they passed go, they collected twice the salary, and they got to roll both dice instead of one, so they got to move around the board a lot more. And over the course of 15 minutes, we watched through hidden cameras what happened. And what I want to do today for the first time is show you a little bit of what we saw. You're going to have to pardon the sound quality in some cases because, again, these were hidden cameras. So we've provided subtitles.
How many 500s did you have?
Just one.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I have 3. I don't know why they gave me so much.
Okay, so it was quickly apparent to players that something was up. One person clearly has a lot more money than the other person, and yet, as the game unfolded, we saw very notable differences and dramatic differences begin to emerge between the two players. The rich player started to move around the board louder, literally smacking the board with their piece as he went around. We were more likely to see signs of dominance and nonverbal signs of displays of power and celebration among the rich players. All right, we had a bowl of pretzels positioned off to the side. It's on the bottom right corner there. That allowed us to watch participants' consumatory behavior. So we're just tracking how many pretzels participants eat.
Are those pretzels a trick?
I don't know.
Okay, so no surprises. People are on to us. They wonder what that bowl of pretzels is doing there in the first place. One even asks, like you just saw, is that bowl of pretzels there as a trick? And yet, despite that, the power of the situation seems to inevitably dominate, and those rich players start to eat more pretzels.
I'm gonna try pretzels. I love pretzels.
And as the game went on, one of the really interesting and dramatic patterns that we observed begin to emerge was that the rich players actually started to become ruder toward the other person. Less and less sensitive to the plight of those poor players, and more demonstrative of their material success. More likely to showcase how well they're doing.
I have some money. I have money for everything.
You owe me $24.
Lose all your money soon.
I'll buy it. I mean, I have so much money.
I have so much money to take me forever.
I'm gonna buy out this whole board.
You're gonna run out of money soon. I'm pretty much untouchable at this point.
Okay, and here's what I think was really interesting, is that at the end of the 15 minutes, we asked the players to talk about their experience during the game. And when the rich players talked about why they'd inevitably won in this rigged game of Monopoly, they talked about what they'd done to buy those different properties and earn their success in the game. And they became far less attuned to all those different features of the situation, including that flip of a coin that had randomly gotten them into that privileged position in the first place. And that's a really incredible insight into how the mind makes sense of advantage. Now, this game of Monopoly can be used as a metaphor for understanding society and its hierarchical structure, wherein some people have a lot of wealth and a lot of status, and a lot of people don't. They have a lot less wealth, and a lot less status, and a lot less access to valued resources. And what my colleagues and I for the last 7 years have been doing is studying the effects of these kinds of hierarchies. What we've been finding across dozens of studies and thousands of participants across this country is that as a person's levels of wealth increase, their feelings of compassion and empathy go down. And their feelings of entitlement, of deservingness, and their ideology of self-interest increases. In surveys, we found that it's actually wealthier individuals who are more likely to moralize greed being good, and that the pursuit of self-interest is favorable and moral. Now, what I want to do today is talk about some of the implications of this ideology of self-interest, talk about why we should care about those implications, and end with what might be done. Some of the first studies that we ran in this area looked at helping behavior, something social psychologists call prosocial behavior. And we were really interested in who's more likely to offer help to another person, someone who's rich or someone who's poor. In one of the studies, we bring in rich and poor members of the community into the lab and give each of them the equivalent of $10. And we told the participants that they could keep these $10 for themselves, or they could share a portion of it, if they wanted to, with a stranger who's totally anonymous. They'll never meet that stranger, and the stranger will never meet them. And we just monitor how much people give. Individuals who made $25,000, sometimes under $15,000 a year, gave 44% more of their money to this stranger than did individuals making $150,000, $200,000 a year. We've had people play games to see who's more or less likely to cheat to increase their chances of winning a prize. In one of the games, we actually rigged a computer so that die rolls over a certain score were impossible. You couldn't get above 12 in this game. And yet, the richer you were, the more likely you were to cheat in this game to earn credits toward a $50 cash prize, sometimes by 3 to 4 times as much. We ran another study where we looked at whether people would be inclined to take candy from a jar of candy that we explicitly identified as being reserved for children.
Unlock a new world of efficiency with Asana. Automate workflows so your team can have less follow-up and more follow-through. Try for free today at asana.com.
Thank you.
Participating, I'm not kidding, I know it sounds like I'm making a joke. We explicitly told participants, this jar of candy is for children participating in a developmental lab nearby. They're in studies, this is for them, and we just monitored how much candy participants took. Participants who felt rich took 2 times as much candy as participants who felt poor. We've even studied cars. Not just any cars, but whether drivers of different kinds of cars are more or less inclined to break the law. In one of these studies, we looked at whether drivers would stop for a pedestrian that we had posed waiting across at a crosswalk. Now in California, as you all know, because I'm sure we all do this, it's the law to stop for a pedestrian who's waiting to cross. So here's an example of how we did it. That's our Confederate off to the left, posing as a pedestrian. He approaches as the red truck successfully stops. In typical California fashion, it's overtaken by the bus who almost runs our pedestrian over. Now here's an example of a more expensive car, a Prius, driving through, and a BMW doing the same. So we did this for hundreds of vehicles on several days, just tracking who stops and who doesn't. What we found was that as the expensiveness of a car increased, the driver's tendencies to break the law increased as well. None of the cars in our least expensive car category broke the law. Close to 50% of the cars in our most expensive vehicle category broke the law. We've run other studies finding that wealthier individuals are more likely to lie in negotiations, to endorse unethical behavior at work, like stealing cash from the cash register, taking bribes, lying to customers. Now, I don't mean to suggest that it's only wealthy people who show these patterns of behavior. Not at all. In fact, I think that we all, in our day-to-day, minute-by-minute lives, struggle with these competing motivations of when or if to put our own interests above the interests of other people. And that's understandable because the American dream is an idea in which we all have an equal opportunity to succeed and prosper, as long as we apply ourselves and work hard. And a piece of that means that sometimes you need to put your own interests above the interests and well-being of other people around you. But what we're finding is that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to pursue a vision of personal success, of achievement and accomplishment to the detriment of others around you. Here I've plotted for you the mean household income received by each fifth and top 5% of the population over the last 20 years. In 1993, the differences between the different quintiles of the population in terms of income are fairly egregious. It's not difficult to discern that there are differences. But over the last 20 years, that significant difference has become a Grand Canyon of sorts between those at the top and everyone else. In fact, the top 20% of our population own close to 90% of the total wealth in this country. We're at unprecedented levels of economic inequality. What that means is that wealth is not only becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a select group of individuals, but the American dream is becoming increasingly unattainable for an increasing majority of us. And if it's the case, as we've been finding, that the wealthier you are, the more entitled you feel to that wealth, and the more likely you are to prioritize your own interests above the interests of other people and be willing to do things to serve that self-interest, well, then there's no reason to think that those patterns will change. In fact, there's every reason to think that they'll only get worse. And that's what it would look like if things just stayed the same at the same linear rate over the next 20 years. Now, inequality, economic inequality, is something we should all be concerned about, not just because of those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but because individuals in groups with lots of economic inequality do worse. Not just the people at the bottom, everyone. There's a lot of really compelling research coming out from top labs all over the world showcasing the range of things that are undermined as economic inequality gets worse. Social mobility, things we really care about, physical health, social trust, all go down as inequality goes up. Similarly, negative things in social collectives and societies. Things like obesity and violence, imprisonment and punishment are exacerbated as economic inequality increases. Again, these are outcomes not just experienced by a few, but that resound across all strata of society. Even people at the top experience these outcomes. So, what do we do? This cascade of self-perpetuating, pernicious, negative effects could seem like something that's spun out of control, and there's nothing we can do about it. Certainly nothing we as individuals could do. But in fact, we've been finding in our own laboratory research that small psychological interventions, small changes to people's values, small nudges in certain directions can restore levels of egalitarianism and empathy. For instance, reminding people of the benefits of cooperation or the advantages of community cause wealthier individuals to be just as egalitarian as poor people. In one study, we had people watch a brief video, just 46 seconds long, about childhood poverty that served as a reminder of the needs of others in the world around them. And after watching that, we looked at how willing people were to offer up their own time to a stranger presented to them in the lab who was in distress. After watching this video, an hour later, rich people became just as generous of their own time to help out this other person, a stranger, as someone who's poor, suggesting that these differences are not innate or categorical, but are so malleable to slight changes in people's values and little nudges of compassion and bumps of empathy. And beyond the walls of our lab, we're even beginning to see signs of change in society. Bill Gates, one of our nation's wealthiest individuals, in his Harvard commencement speech, talked about the problem facing society of inequality as being the most daunting challenge, and talked about what must be done to combat it, saying, humanity's greatest advances are not in its discoveries, but in how those discoveries are applied to reduce inequity. And there's the Giving Pledge, in which more than 100 of our nation's wealthiest individuals are pledging half of their fortunes to charity. And there's the emergence of dozens of grassroots movements, like We Are the 1%, the Resource Generation, or Wealth for Common Good, in which the most privileged members of the population, members of the 1% and elsewhere, people who are wealthy, are using their own economic resources, adults and youth alike. That's what's most striking to me. Leveraging their own privilege, their own economic resources to combat inequality by advocating for social policies, changes in social values, and changes in people's behavior that work against their own economic interests, but that may ultimately restore the American dream. Thank you.
All right, and we could look at that video on a lot of different levels, right? We could look at the message as it applies to how we function as a society. And I do want you to talk about that a little, but I also want you to talk through right now about the design of the experiment, specifically the Monopoly and the car experiment. Want you to talk about that experimental design and then any confounding variables you could find in that, all right? And we're gonna start numbering off 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah, if you guys say it out loud. 1, or 1, yeah. We don't want you to be by yourself. So 1s are gonna come up here and then we'll have 2s and 3s. All right, so some of you will have to move. I want you to take about 5 or 6 minutes. There's a whole lot to unpack on this video and I'm anxious to hear from you.
In class last semester. I did it with 4 people instead of just 2, so it was really
Okay,
exciting.
yeah, I remember she needed to borrow Monopoly and all I had was Catopoly, I think, to offer her one year, yeah.
Yeah, it was exciting.
It's like compounding ideas inside those experiments, right?
Well, just thinking like when you talk about like the results of the car study, are there confounding variables that might help explain why people stopped or didn't stop beyond how affluent looking their car was? Does that clarify?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's great she does that experiment with you.
With Monopoly. It was randomly assigned. It's definitely can be you get somebody who's like that anyway. Just to get the
Yeah, you just
more.
just trying to get the ones first they become like the Shire, like happen to have like the
Could have
ones
not
that
seen them either, there was a sign right there.
about it anyway.
It's kind of like walking around the sign every time.
And even as
I
far as
don't really pay very much attention when I drive, so I probably
brand
won't.
too.
Yeah.
Some people are just to show who you are, just resign to like not. It is what it is.
Like, yeah, when they already feel like they're losing in the beginning, they just kind of give up on it, or oh, whatever.
Well, when I played, there were still ways that where people
I
could
thought the pretzel one was funny because
it was just about the fact
like I was just thinking about like if it was me.
you had to be, yeah, you're at a disadvantage, but you also have to be really selective with what you do. So like I think when the rich person is playing, they can kind of have more freedom to do what they want, but the poor player, like,
They had like a
do I really want to buy this land or not? Because I only have $500. You know what I mean? So I think some factors I could change that would be like
they put a bowl of pretzels
Some
there.
people are like,
Pretzels could distract.
awful, like we console ourselves.
And they could be like stress eating or something.
They don't want to eat.
Or, I don't know.
Yeah, whether they, when they get excited, whether they're gonna get calm themselves down.
Yeah. So just eating them, yeah.
The ones who are in the car experiment, I think one of the variable ones would be just like the person in general, they're not a nicer person, like focus. Like they would just generally let the do whatever you can to get that temperament, whereas some people are like, I know
Also,
people
like,
I know
kind
people
of,
have really fancy cars and they act that way. And I know people have like nice cars and
It's
they're like,
interesting that they pointed
fly
out,
or like through
this was all by chance, it's a flip of a coin, like you could have been the rich person, I could have been the rich person.
Where the drivers.
It's just interesting, like, would the other person talk to you the same way, if I was the rich person instead of you, you know what I mean?
Utah that may not realize like, hey, California state laws, like, if they're waiting, you have to stop. They might be waiting for like a light or something like that to let them.
Low-key really like
So they
TED
may be-
Talks. I used to hate them, I used to think they were so boring. Now I really like them.
that was a really neat one.
Yeah.
There's not a light or anything telling me to. I don't want to be that guy that like holds up traffic when I'm not supposed to, so.
And then another thing too, not even just state, but just like area they live in, like I know somebody from Tulsa is probably gonna interact differently versus someone from like I live in Pryor where it's like a small town. Like if it's Pryor, like there's not usually very many people walking, so if you see somebody, you're gonna run over. So you see somebody by the road, you're just like, and just keep going. So it just really depends on area, like mindset.
Yeah, and they were
Some of it too, like with the poorest cars, like the
Yeah, like they were retreating,
that's a bad way. So with
Yeah.
the less expensive cars.
Cause it really is.
It might be a case where, yeah, I normally wouldn't stop.
Yeah.
I can't afford a ticket right now, so I'm gonna just because I can't afford
I
to
also
do
thought it
it.
was interesting that they talked about, they acted like they worked for what they were buying. They didn't, you know what I mean?
Okay, everyone, we just have a couple of minutes, so we'll go ahead and talk. Let's hear from this group first.
So
The nature in general, for the monopoly.
yeah, we were talking about how in Monopoly, like it depends on like the person themselves, the mindset, even though it was randomly assigned, like some people are naturally more like showboaty when they win or
Yeah, true.
like if they're losing are more quiet and just in general.
Yeah, so you're saying that could deal with temperament and personality, that, right?
And another thing I pointed out was like they're talking about like the snacks, like they were like monitoring how much one person ate versus the other. And I was thinking about like some people just don't like pretzels and stuff. Like that one dude was like, I love pretzels.
Yes,
Like, some people
exactly,
do.
exactly. But more people like goldfish, you think?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But monitoring that is like, you know, people have personal preference. If it was more like an array of snacks, I could understand.
Yeah,
But if it's
yeah.
just like the one, it's kind of hard to
Good
like.
point. Okay, so small things that could make a big difference. Yeah.
Like, some people, kind of like self-soothe with food. So if you're one of the haves in that situation, like you're bound to know, hey, maybe this is a little bit awkward. That might be hey, this will make me feel a little bit less bad about this.
Sure.
Maybe, like it always could be.
Yeah, like to somehow maybe lessen any kind of guilt you
Social,
have.
yeah, just to,
Yeah, interesting. All right. We're going to move on because we just have a tiny bit of time left. We'll talk more next time on this.
We kind of talked about like basically entitlement between different people. It can time money and it can't. She made a point about like how well some people like take care of their cars.
Uh-huh.
So like slamming on your brakes, like obviously that deteriorates your brakes more than just slowly braking. And if you're slamming your brakes for someone to walk.
Right, right.
that's important too.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Others?
We also talked about like that he was walking kind of around a sign every time. And so, you know, you could be distracted by something else and not see him walking up to the curb and
Yes.
something like that. Or you could be late for work or
Yeah. And they were they in Marin County for this?
I just remember they said somewhere in California.
Okay. Marin County is a very wealthy area, so I don't know like what the variation was in cars. So that's where we will pick